Don't know her name, history doesn't remember it, and that was the point. She lived somewhere south of the Sahara before maps meant anything to the people who would erase her. She had a family, a language, a place in the world, and then one morning armed men came. By nightfall, her village no longer existed. This didn't happen once. It didn't happen for a generation. It happened for over 13 centuries. When people talk about slavery, they usually picture ships crossing the Atlantic. Chains, plantations, the Americas, and yes, that history matters. 12 million Africans taken across the ocean over 400 years. A crime so vast it reshaped the modern world, but there was another slave trade, older, longer, and designed so thoroughly that almost no descendants remain to testify that it ever happened. This is the Arab and Trans-Saharan slave trade. From the 7th century until the modern era, into the lifetimes of people's grandparents, millions of Africans were captured and transported north and east, across deserts, along rivers, through routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean world. Historians estimate 14 to 17 million people were taken. Some believe the real number is higher. Yet unlike the Atlantic trade, this system left behind almost nothing. No massive descendant populations, no monuments, no national reckoning, just silence. And silence doesn't happen by accident. It was engineered. Men were stripped of the ability to form families. Women were absorbed, renamed, and erased into households where their origins dissolved within a generation. Children born from them grew up speaking other languages, practicing other customs, carrying no memory of where their mothers came from. Over time, entire peoples vanished, not through extinction, but through deliberate human design. This trade did not rely on random brutality. It was organized, commercial, profitable. A machine refined over centuries. African kingdoms were drawn into it. Some resisted, others participated. Weapons flowed south, human beings flowed north. The more captives delivered, the more power a kingdom gained over its neighbors. Violence became currency. Caravans crossed the Sahara in chains of human cargo stretching for miles. The desert itself became a weapon, heat by day, cold by night, thirst always. Those who could not walk were abandoned where they fell. European travelers who later crossed these routes wrote of something they could never forget: bones marking the road, skulls half buried in sand, paths paved not by stone but by people. And for those who survived the journey, survival did not mean freedom, it meant markets. Cities like Cairo, Tripoli, Tunis, Zanzibar, places that built wealth on systems of human sale refined over 1,000 years. Buyers evaluated lives the way livestock is evaluated. Age, strength, origin, use, every person reduced to a calculation, and when the trade finally ended, it didn't end with justice. There was no great emancipation, no universal reckoning. It simply faded under pressure, not remorse. What remained was absence, no mass communities to preserve memory. No names in family trees, no stories passed down, just questions history avoided asking. Where did 14 million people go? If you want to understand why almost no descendants remain, you have to understand design. This was not chaos. This was not incidental cruelty. This was a system built to solve a specific problem. How do you exploit millions of people for centuries without leaving behind millions of people who remember? The answer was methodical. For men, the system was simple and final. Across trade routes stretching from the Nile Valley to the Red Sea, males were separated early. Not at random, by age, strength, resale value. Most would never be allowed to form families, not because of hatred, because families create roots. Roots create resistance. Sources from multiple centuries, Arabic, European, and African, describe the same pattern: African men reduced to labor units with no future lineage. They worked, they aged, they died. And they were replaced, no sons to remember them, no grandchildren to ask questions. For women, the system took a different approach. They were not erased immediately. They were absorbed. Women were renamed, their languages forbidden, their religions overwritten. They were trained explicitly to disappear into households, courts, and palaces, their identities dismantled piece by piece and rebuilt for service. Some entered the great imperial households of the era. Others were sent to merchant homes. Many lived lives that never entered a single record. A woman who gave birth changed legal status, but not history. Her child was free, yes, but free as something else. different language, different name, different people. Within a generation, African origins blurred. Within two, they vanished. This was not accidental assimilation. It was demographic erasure, and it worked. Look at the map. After over a millennium of importing Africans into North Africa and the Middle East, you would expect vast descendant populations, entire regions shaped visibly by that history. Instead, there are fragments, scattered communities, traces where there should be millions. Compare that to the Atlantic world. In the Americas, slavery created forced reproduction. Enslaved populations were deliberately grown. Their descendants exist in undeniable numbers today. They carry memory. They demand reckoning. But this system was different. This one consumed people without reproducing them. The machine required constant replenishment, so the raids continued. African states were pulled into the logic. Some resisted fiercely, others adapted. Weapons arrived through coastal and desert routes. Captives became currency. War shifted purpose not to claim land but to claim bodies. Entire regions destabilized for centuries. And then there was the crossing. The Sahara was not a backdrop, it was a filter. Caravans moved slowly, measured not in distance but in survival. Those who collapsed were abandoned, not out of rage, out of efficiency. The desert erased what the market did not need. European travelers who later followed these routes did not describe ancient ruins. They described bones, paths outlined by skeletons, valleys pale with remains. Human loss so normalized it became geography. These were not isolated tragedies. They were the infrastructure of the trade. And when the outside world finally intervened, it wasn't because the system collapsed under its own horror. It was forced piecemeal by external pressure. British naval patrols in the Indian Ocean, treaties imposed on rulers like the Sultan of Zanzibar, colonial borders that disrupted caravan routes. Even then, the trade did not end cleanly. It went underground, it lingered. Formal abolition came late, shockingly late, into the 20th century, within living memory. And when it ended, there were no mass emancipations, no collective moment of freedom, just silence, no memorials, no museums, no global reckoning, because there was no one left in numbers large enough to force one. And that is the final cruelty of this history, not only the suffering, not only the scale, but the success. A system that erased people so completely that the modern world barely knows they existed. In part 3, we confront the question history avoids most. Why this story is still uncomfortable to tell and who benefits from the silence. Because forgetting is not neutral and silence is never accidental. History does not forget by accident. It forgets because forgetting is useful. If you want to understand why the Arab and Trans-Saharan slave trade is still absent from mainstream memory, you have to stop asking what happened and start asking who benefited from the silence. Because silence protects power. For centuries, this trade operated in plain sight. It was legal, regulated, taxed, documented selectively. It existed within empires that considered themselves the inheritors of civilization, faith, and law. It was woven into everyday life so thoroughly that many contemporaries did not even describe it as cruelty. They described it as commerce. That normalization is the first reason this history disappeared. When an atrocity is ordinary, it rarely produces records of outrage. Bureaucracies record prices, not pain. Contracts, not screams. Legal texts discuss ownership, not loss. And when a system lasts long enough, its victims stop being described as people at all. They become categories: labor, servants, property. The second reason is more uncomfortable. The end of this trade did not come from an internal moral revolution. It came from pressure, naval, diplomatic, and colonial. Abolition was imposed unevenly, often reluctantly, and frequently circumvented. There was no moment equivalent to an emancipation proclamation, no decisive rupture that forced societies to confront what had been done. When wrongdoing ends without reckoning, memory fades quickly. And then there is the third reason, perhaps the most decisive of all. The victims left no large, unified descendant populations to demand remembrance. In the Atlantic world, the descendants of enslaved Africans exist in undeniable numbers. Their presence shapes politics, culture, scholarship, and public memory. They force societies to look backward because they are living proof of what happened. This system produced the opposite outcome. Men were prevented from forming families. Women's children were absorbed and renamed. Lineages dissolved. There was no community left to say, "This was done to us." So the story did what unchallenged stories do. It vanished, but absence is not innocence. Across North Africa and the Middle East, the legacy of slavery lingers in language, in social hierarchies, in racial attitudes that are rarely examined. Words that trace back to enslavement still exist. Assumptions about skin color, origin, and status remain embedded in social life, often unacknowledged, often denied. Ask people today and many will say, "That was long ago," or worse, "That wasn't really slavery." This is the fourth reason for silence, denial disguised as distance. Calling something ancient makes it feel irrelevant, but this trade did not end in antiquity. It extended into the modern era. Formal abolition occurred in some places well into the 20th century. That proximity makes people uncomfortable because it collapses the illusion that this was a distant moral failure unrelated to the present. It shaped regions, it shaped economies. It shaped demographic realities that still exist today, and yet it is rarely taught. Part of that absence comes from geopolitics. Modern international relationships rely on selective memory. Nations choose which histories to foreground and which to downplay based on diplomacy, alliances, and strategic interests. Acknowledging this trade openly would complicate narratives of moral authority, cultural identity, and historical victimhood. So instead it is minimized, or reframed, or ignored. Even within academic circles, the topic has often been treated cautiously. Scholars who write about it carefully qualify every claim, aware that the subject sits at the intersection of religion, race, and politics, three areas where truth is frequently negotiated rather than accepted. That caution has consequences. When scholars hesitate, popular history fills the vacuum. And popular history, when disconnected from rigor, swings between denial and sensationalism. Either nothing happened or it happened in ways exaggerated beyond evidence. Both extremes undermine understanding. The result is confusion, not clarity. And confusion is fertile ground for forgetting. But there is another reason this story disappeared, one that speaks to how humans process trauma. This history does not offer a redemptive arc. There is no collective liberation story here. No uprising that reshaped the system. No triumphant ending where justice clearly prevails. The trade did not collapse under the weight of moral awakening. It withered under pressure, shifted underground, and dissolved without ceremony. Its victims were not remembered because remembrance requires continuity, and continuity was precisely what this system destroyed. That makes the story difficult to tell. People want narratives with resolution. This one offers none. It offers only loss. Loss of lives, loss of cultures, loss of names, loss of memory. And so it is easier to focus elsewhere. But ignoring this history does not make it less real. It only makes it more dangerous because unexamined histories repeat themselves in subtler forms. Modern human trafficking still follows some of the same roots. Racial hierarchies shaped by centuries of enslavement still influence social structures, and myths about the past still inform how societies understand themselves today. Silence is not neutral, it is active. It allows old ideas to persist unchallenged. It allows descendants, however distant, to live without acknowledging how their worlds were built. It allows victims to remain anonymous forever. And anonymity is the final victory of any system built on exploitation. There's a reason archaeologists occasionally uncover mass graves in deserts far from cities and records, people who died during crossings, people abandoned when they could no longer walk, people whose names never entered any ledger. Those remains do not come with stories. They do not tell us who these people loved, what languages they spoke, what songs they sang. All they tell us is this: they were here, and that should be enough to matter. Remembering this history is not about assigning collective guilt. It is not about weaponizing the past. It is about resisting erasure. Because when a system succeeds in destroying memory, the least we can do is rebuild it, carefully, honestly, without spectacle, not to shock, not to accuse. But to acknowledge, to say this happened, to say these people existed, to say their absence is not natural. History is not only what survives in books and monuments, it is also what is missing and why. And the silence surrounding this trade is one of the loudest absences in human history. In the final part, we will ask the hardest question of all. What does remembering look like when there are no descendants to remember, and what responsibility does that leave with us? Because memory does not belong only to those who inherit it. Sometimes it belongs to those willing to listen. Say the word when you're ready and we'll conclude the series. When people ask why this history matters, what they're really asking is a harder question. Who is responsible for remembering a crime when its victims were erased so completely that no one is left to demand remembrance? Most histories survive because someone carries them forward. A family, a community, a people who refuse to forget. This one didn't leave that behind. That wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system, so remembrance here cannot work the way it usually does. There are no large descendant communities organizing commemorations, no annual rituals passed down through generations, no inherited stories told at kitchen tables. What exists instead are fragments, court records, travel journals, market accounts, legal treatises discussing ownership as casually as property tax, and occasionally bones. Scattered across deserts, hidden in forgotten graves, unearthed by accident centuries later. These fragments are all that remain of millions of lives, so the question becomes, what do we do with fragments? The first responsibility is honesty. This history cannot be reduced to slogans or numbers alone. Numbers matter, but numbers without context can become abstract, and abstraction is another form of erasure. At the same time, exaggeration weakens credibility and gives denial an opening. So we must hold two truths at once. This trade was vast, long-lasting, and devastating, and its exact dimensions are complex, uneven, and debated. That tension is not a weakness. It is the nature of historical truth. Some routes were deadlier than others. Some regions were more heavily targeted. Some periods intensified, others slowed. But the continuity, the fact that this system endured for over a millennium, is beyond dispute, and endurance changes everything. A crime committed briefly can be condemned and contained. A crime normalized over centuries reshapes entire worlds. The second responsibility is resisting false equivalence. Remembering this history does not require minimizing others. The Atlantic slave trade was a catastrophe. So were systems in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Human exploitation is not a competition. But silence about one history because another is better known is not balance, it is distortion. Each system had different mechanics, different outcomes, different legacies. Understanding one does not diminish another. It clarifies how varied and adaptable human cruelty can be. The third responsibility is confronting why this story still provokes discomfort. For some, it challenges religious narratives. For others, national identities. For others still, simplified moral maps of history that divide the world neatly into villains and victims. This history refuses those comforts. It implicates African elites who participated. It implicates Arab merchants and empires who profited. It implicates European powers that intervened late and often selectively. There is no single antagonist to condemn and move on from, and that makes the story harder to tell but more necessary, because histories that are easy to assign blame to are rarely the ones that teach us the most. The fourth responsibility is evidence. We must listen to the people who witnessed this system when it was still alive, travelers who crossed the Sahara Desert and described roads lined with remains, missionaries who recorded the separation of families, administrators who wrote casually about markets in Cairo that had operated for centuries. These were not activists trying to make a point. Many were deeply uncomfortable writing what they saw. Some tried to soften their language, others refused to publish at all. Their reluctance is part of the evidence. So is the bureaucratic tone of legal documents discussing enslaved people as units of value. When a system is evil enough, it stops needing justification. It becomes background noise. The fifth responsibility is resisting the temptation to sensationalize. This history does not need embellishment. It does not need shock for impact. It does not need modern projection to feel relevant. What it needs is clarity. Clarity about mechanisms. Clarity about incentives, clarity about outcomes. Sensationalism turns suffering into spectacle, and spectacle distances the viewer. It allows people to react emotionally without understanding structurally. Understanding structure is what prevents repetition. And that brings us to the sixth responsibility, connecting past to present without forcing parallels. Modern societies across North Africa and the Middle East are not identical to their historical predecessors. Cultures change. Laws change, people change, but history leaves residues, attitudes towards skin color, class hierarchies, language that still carries the imprint of enslavement. These are not accusations, they are observations. Ignoring them does not make them disappear. Examining them carefully without defensiveness is the only way they ever will. The seventh responsibility is humility. We cannot fully reconstruct the lives that were erased. We cannot give names where none survived. We cannot restore languages that were lost. What we can do is refuse to let absence be mistaken for insignificance. A lack of descendants does not mean a lack of suffering. A lack of monuments does not mean a lack of crime. A lack of memory does not mean a lack of responsibility. Sometimes remembrance means standing in front of an empty space and acknowledging that it should not be empty. That is uncomfortable. That is unsatisfying. That is necessary, because forgetting is easy. Forgetting requires no effort, no courage, no self-examination. Remembering does. Remembering requires sitting with ambiguity, accepting that history does not always offer heroes, admitting that some systems succeeded precisely because they destroyed the ability to remember them, and then choosing to remember anyway. There is a final responsibility, one that belongs not to historians alone, but to anyone who hears this story, to resist the instinct to turn away. To resist the urge to say, this is too dark, or this is too complicated, or this doesn't involve me. Because the measure of a civilization is not only how it treats its living, but how it acknowledges its dead, especially the ones who left no voice behind. We often say history is written by the victors, but some histories are written by no one at all. They exist only in gaps, in silences, in deserts where the wind still moves sand over bones no one remembers to name. Those people do not ask us for guilt. They do not ask us for reparations. They do not ask us for anything at all. They cannot. All they ask, if the past can ask anything, is not to be erased twice. Once was enough. In the final part, we will close not with answers, but with a reckoning. What does justice look like when justice was never possible? And what does it mean to remember without owning someone else's pain? There is a moment every honest history reaches where it stops offering solutions. This is that moment, because the question at the end of this story is not what should have happened. That answer is obvious. The question is what can possibly be done now when the damage was designed to leave no one behind to demand repair. Justice, as we usually imagine it, depends on survivors, on descendants, on living communities who can point to the past and say, this was done to us. Here, that chain was severed. So what does justice look like when there is no one left to claim it? The uncomfortable answer is that justice, in the conventional sense, may no longer be possible. No tribunal can hear testimony that was erased before it could be spoken. No compensation can restore languages that vanished. No memorial can name people whose names were never recorded. And yet, ending the conversation, there would be another form of abandonment. Because while justice may be limited, responsibility is not. Responsibility does not require inheritance. It does not require guilt by blood. It requires awareness and choice. The first responsibility is to reject comforting myths. One of the most persistent myths about this history is that it was inevitable, that it was simply how the world worked at the time, that judging it now is anachronistic. This myth collapses under even minimal scrutiny. People knew this was wrong while it was happening. They wrote about it. They condemned it. They struggled against it, often at great personal cost. African communities resisted. Some fought wars to stop raids. Religious scholars debated the morality of the trade. European observers, hardly moral heroes themselves, were still horrified by what they witnessed. Evil does not require ignorance. It often survives because people decide its benefits outweigh their discomfort. The second myth is that speaking about this history is inherently divisive. It is not. What is divisive is selective memory, choosing which victims count and which can be ignored because acknowledging them would complicate present identities or alliances. Silence creates resentment precisely because it denies reality. Truth, spoken carefully, does the opposite. It creates the possibility, however limited, of understanding. The second responsibility is accuracy. This history has been distorted from both directions. On one side, denial minimizes the scale, the duration, or the brutality. framing it as marginal, exaggerated, or misrepresented. On the other, sensationalism inflates numbers or collapses centuries into a single narrative of uniform horror, flattening complexity and undermining credibility. Both approaches serve forgetting. Accuracy is slower, less emotionally satisfying, more resistant to easy conclusions. But accuracy is the only way memory survives without becoming propaganda. That means acknowledging debates among historians. It means differentiating regions, periods, and practices. It means saying we don't know where records truly fail. Honesty about limits strengthens memory, it does not weaken it. The third responsibility is restraint. This history does not belong to us to weaponize. It should not be used to score political points, to justify modern hatred, or to claim moral superiority. Doing so repeats the logic of exploitation, using the suffering of others for present gain. Remembering responsibly means refusing to turn trauma into identity theft. These lives were not symbols, they were people, and people do not exist to serve arguments. The fourth responsibility is language. Words carry residues. Many societies shaped by this trade still use terms that trace back to enslavement, words that encode hierarchies long after their origins are forgotten. Challenging those words is not about policing speech. It is about understanding what language preserves when memory does not. Language often remembers what history forgets. Examining it carefully is one way of tracing the outlines of what was erased. The fifth responsibility is presence. Memory does not require monuments to exist, but it does require attention. That attention can take many forms, teaching this history without euphemism, including it in curricula rather than footnotes. Supporting scholarship that treats it seriously rather than cautiously. Acknowledging its legacy when discussing race, migration, and inequality in regions it shaped. None of this requires collective guilt. It requires collective maturity. The sixth responsibility is humility. There is a temptation when encountering a history this vast and unresolved to seek closure. Closure is not available here. There is no final lesson that redeems the suffering, no moral balance that evens the scales. No narrative arc that resolves cleanly. What remains is discomfort, and that discomfort is appropriate. Some histories are not meant to comfort the present, they are meant to unsettle it. The seventh responsibility, and perhaps the most important, is refusal. Refusal to allow absence to be mistaken for insignificance. Refusal to let silence be interpreted as consent. Refusal to let erasure complete its work, because erasure does not end when the last victim dies. It ends only when memory is deliberately restored. Not perfectly, not completely, but intentionally. This is where standing witness matters. Standing witness does not mean claiming authority over a past you did not live. It means acknowledging that your present exists partly because of choices made long before you were born. Standing witness means saying, I know this happened, even if I cannot fully understand it. It means holding space for lives that left no descendants to speak for them. It means accepting that some debts cannot be paid but can still be named, and naming matters. When archaeologists uncover remains in deserts, bodies left where caravans abandoned them, they do not find stories, they find evidence. Evidence that these people walked until they could not. Evidence that someone decided it was cheaper to let them die. Evidence that a system functioned exactly as intended. Those remains ask for nothing. They do not accuse, they do not demand, they simply exist. And in that existence is a question posed to the living. Will you let this be forgotten again? Memory is not owned by those with the loudest voices or the strongest claims. Sometimes memory belongs to those willing to sit with silence and refuse to treat it as emptiness. The Atlantic slave trade left descendants who ensure it cannot be forgotten. This trade left almost none, which means remembrance here is not inherited, it is chosen. Chosen every time someone decides to learn rather than look away. Chosen every time a teacher includes this history rather than skipping it. Chosen every time a viewer lessens without demanding comfort or resolution. Chosen every time we resist the urge to simplify what should not be simplified. This is not about rewriting the past, it is about refusing to let the past erase itself. The woman whose name we will never know, the one taken from a village that no longer exists, does not need us to imagine her pain in detail. She does not need us to speak for her. She needs only this: that we acknowledge she lived, that we acknowledge she was taken, that we acknowledge she mattered, even if the system was designed to ensure no one would ever say so. Memory, when done honestly, is not an act of ownership. It is an act of restraint, of listening where no voice remains, of naming what others preferred to leave unnamed, of standing witness without claiming inheritance. That is all that can be done. And sometimes that is enough: silence, then wind over sand. This is not the end of the story, but it is the end of pretending the silence means nothing. If this mattered to you, don't treat it as content, treat it as memory, because some histories survive only if we choose to carry them. And once you see that absence clearly, you can't unsee it.